Bob Muglia has been leading teams of all sizes for decades. His broad experience in the tech world comes in a large part from a career of firefighting, taking over a problem area and wrestling it back into shape. He has touched literally every facet of tech, from databases and tools to operating systems to applications, even phone and internet properties. Throughout this journey, Bob has built and led teams as large as 10,000 as they face some of the most difficult technical challenges. Bob is most ardent when discussing what he calls values-based leadership. He firmly believes that what a company does is a direct descendant of how a company does it.
The culture of a company is now embedded in their products and present, and I can see it. As a guy that looks at and knows these companies and knows the cultures, I know the Microsoft culture, and I go, dang, look what they just did. That was stupid as hell, and they did it for cultural reasons. And I know why they did it, because I know that company. And I can see similar things. I don't know Google or Amazon as well, but I see similar things in those companies. When they make mistakes, it's often culturally rooted.
Bob took that understanding from IBM to Microsoft to Juniper and most recently to Snowflake. He was the CEO of the startup as it built a revolutionary approach to managing data at scale and as it prepared for their initial public offering. Until the day he wasn't. And that's what this is all about. This is Leading Smart, the show about managing in the brainpower age. It's a field guide to the joys and challenges of leading and working in the modern workplace. I'm Chris Williams, your guide to the stories and ideas that I hope will inspire you to be a better leader in the world of knowledge work. This episode's conversation is with a leader who believes culture is the root of organizational success. This is episode 238, my conversation with Bob Muglia. Bob Muglia grew up in Michigan and went to the University of Michigan. In 1981, he was recruited from there to work for Rome, the leader in taking corporate telephone systems into the digital age.
And I interviewed with a number of companies. I interviewed with Motorola. I interviewed with Texas Instruments. This is with a totally different period of time, right? So I went to Champaign, Illinois, which is where Motorola was. And I went to Texas and saw TI. I saw a few companies. Rome was different. I mean, Rome was just a different company. And once I saw it, it was like, my God, if I could get this job, I'll take this job. And they very much focused on a great place to work. They were very ahead of their time in terms of workplace environments. They had a rec center, a pool, like a full lap pool. And it was really neat. It was a neat environment. And of course, Silicon Valley even then had a strong cachet to it. Not to mention, probably the biggest thing is that my first trip to Santa Clara. I'd been to California once when I was 10, but my first trip to go out to see Rome was in February, and it was 75 degrees. And it was like, wow, this is, it's like 20 below in Michigan, like it normally is. And I was like, well, if I can get this. And I was a developer on Rome made telecommunications systems. They called them CBX. PBX was the category. They were the first digital PBX in the 1970s. They transformed the industry from analog to digital because AT&T was a dinosaur, and really a dinosaur. And Rome reinvigorated that, even though in today's world it seems pretty simplistic. But it was digital audio. They were the first to do phone mail. Phone mail was originated at Rome. So voicemail, which is, of course, scourge on the world, but nonetheless they invented it, and so it was a great place to go. I learned a lot.
And was that the first place you started to do team management and leadership work?
Yeah, I joined as a developer. I wrote code. My first management job was probably 84, something like that. So I wasn't that far out of college, and maybe 85. And I started managing a small team that was doing a system on an IBM PC. We had just gotten bought. Actually, it must have been 85 because it was right about the time that ROM got bought by IBM. And so we were developing an IBM PC app to do configuration for the CBXs.
Do you remember moving from an individual contributor to being a manager? Do you remember that? I mean, for most people, that's
big
sort
change.
of, yeah.
It's a big change. That, and then when you are managing managers, and then particularly once you're two levels away, when you have the distance, those are the sort of the big changes in growth cycles for managers. Yeah, I do. It was a very interesting experience. I was working for a man who's still a personal friend of mine. I was literally just talking to him yesterday. So I was working for a guy who we met. In fact, he and his wife are, we met at, as they were getting married, and we're still close friends with them. I was working with my customer. It was an internal customer. The lady that ran it was somewhat psychotic. She was actually not a bad person. I actually liked her in some ways, but she had very serious challenges. And so it was a very, very, very dysfunctional environment. And so I think I have a history of entering into or being part of dysfunctional environments. Hopefully I improve them, not always perhaps, but hopefully I improve them. In this case, I think I learned a lot, and because it was my first experience, and we did do pretty well. We certainly succeeded. But it was really interesting because I remember, in that case, I used a beginner technique in management that you still pull out occasionally, but is almost always the wrong thing to do, which is us against them. And yet it was almost essential in that case. Sometimes it almost is, and I saw this at Microsoft a number of times, because when you have people that are out to do things that are just not correct, you sometimes have to do that. But it's almost never the right thing to do. I mean, when you're in that kind of dysfunction, you have fundamental problems. And my first situation was actually, I would characterize as pretty much that.
It's not good because it doesn't last, right? I mean, but it
never ends well.
Right.
It just never ends particularly well. I mean, even if you succeed, it's a very shallow victory at some fundamental level, and usually it's the cost of someone else, and that's never a good thing. I much prefer the win-win scenarios where everybody. I tried to create situations in my career where everybody wins. I always try and do that, and and interestingly, I rarely find situations where that is not possible. And one of the things I've sort of learned over time is it is not a zero-sum game. The world is far too big, and we used to. I mean, at Microsoft, oh my God, were we zero sum? I mean, oh my God, in the 1990s. I mean, that largely is what got us into the whole DOJ trouble. And it just isn't that way in the world. I mean, it's not worth it.
So how did you end up getting to Microsoft?
It was an interesting story. It's actually a great story. Rom offered a sabbatical after 7 years, 3 months, which was a great deal. My wife and I met at Rom. We'd both been there for like 5.5 years when we met. So we got married and took a sabbatical. We both decided that after we got back, this is the problem with sabbaticals, is people leave. And we both decided we would leave afterwards. We were working at the time still in Rome, but it was IBM, right? It was IBM. So we were working for IBM, and which was terrible then. That was the 80s. It was Acres days. I mean, IBM was, it was a dinosaur. I mean, Acres was killing the company. And so it was a terrible place to be. Laura had been looking at Microsoft. My wife, Laura Ellen, had been looking at Microsoft. She went to college and Stanford MBA, and she was at Rome in marketing, and she was looking for a marketing role at another high tech company. And she found she scouted out Microsoft and said, in 1985 at least, that, PCs, little large words were PCs are the future. Microsoft has both the applications and the operating system, where Lotus, for example, or Ashton Tate at the time had only the applications. And so her view was Microsoft was the place to be. And so she focused on getting to Microsoft. And we had made a decision as a couple, believe it or not, in 1987, that the Bay Area was too crowded and we didn't want to raise a family in the Bay Area. So we decided we were going to move out of the Bay Area. That was a decision we had made. And so with Microsoft and stuff, we were, and then I had this other company up here, we were targeting Seattle.
You come and you're working on SQL Server, and then you ended up in the OS2 arena. That was a frothy time. Was that interesting, invigorating, challenging, depressing, nerve-wracking?
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing. It was amazing. One of the most amazing experiences of my life. Because, first of all, I just come out of IBM. Remember that. And I didn't tell you this. When I was at Rome, the project I was working on was transferred by IBM to Boca Raton. So they said, okay, we're not going to develop this in Santa Clara anymore. We're going to do it in our facilities in Boca Raton. And IBM was a huge facility there. Cavernous, really very unpleasant in my experience. It's just a very unpleasant environment it's like what you would build in the 60s it doesn't look, it looks incredibly old. And that process of transferring the project to Boca was so depressing. That was depressing. Because the people we were working with had no interest in working. Literally, as I said to my team, I said, literally, the people that we're transferring this to have on their 3270 terminal, because that's what they had in front of them, every day when they came in, and these are people that are 30 years old, I said, these are people that have, the first thing it says is, you have 15,482 days till you retire. It was literally like, it was really a very negative, and people did not have the energy. It was an energy-free environment. And so when I was at SQL Server, I came in and did SQL Server and got the first version of that shipped, and then almost immediately transferred, shortly after transferred to do OS2 program management. And again, that was with IBM in Boca Raton. Okay, so I knew the facility, even though I actually didn't do travel from Microsoft down to Boca. Paul Moritz, if you remember, Paul was traveling there frequently. And so, that was an opportunity where I had to I was now able to sit in on a lot of very serious executive and strategic conversations. But, OS2 was supposed to be the next big thing. And everybody was writing about it, the press and, all the rags and everything. But it was terrible because the same situation that I had experienced at Rome, we were experiencing at Microsoft, where the people that IBM were putting on it were just not capable of doing the job. And there was just amazing conflict between the companies. And it was fascinating because, I was in the room when, Paul declared, it was it was a small group of his closest associates that worked for him. When he had just arrived that morning, he'd just come in from Boca. He'd spent the day there the day before, and he arrived and he said, it's not going to work. So at that moment, in my opinion, it was done. And it was everything from there on.
In many ways, that was a cultural problem, right? Microsoft was incredibly high energy and focused and technologically pushing the envelope, and IBM was old and
and concerned about compatibility with the mainframe. The worst, you look at these things. This makes me realize, and these things are super related. Okay, especially when you're doing technology development. The strategic decisions and motivation and things are all deeply intertwined. So like a strategic decision that was death for OS2 was to make Presentation Manager, I think it's the focus point, the point zero of it instead of the upper left-hand corner like everything else was in the lower right, because that's the way the 3270 did it. And it was just like, oh my God, everything was upside down and backwards in Presentation Manager. And every other decision, essentially, I mean, I'm sure there were 100 other terrible decisions that got them into the state, but things like, I've learned that decisions like that are irrecoverable because the technology people could not stand it. I mean, they went nuts with the whole thing. And then so there was this whole Windows, I mean, everything people wanted to work and the way this thing was working was not correct. And again, these are decisions that were strategic decisions that were made in order to maintain existing businesses that did not allow them to properly transcend into the new world. And then it has the overlay that the people they have this weight on their back. And so they're not able to succeed. Now, I think in IBM, there's deep cultural issues that go way beyond this because I literally have only hired one person in my career. This is a terrible thing. I've really only been successful in hiring one IBM person in my whole career. I mean, the DEC people, oh my God, I love DEC people. They're all very old right now, unfortunately. They're mostly retired. I'm
a DEC alum.
Well, that says something. I mean, DEC was a great company. Digital was a great engineering company. That was a great company. Now, it died for a variety of reasons, but just like I think you can hire people from Amazon today and you get a set of training associated with running businesses that you don't see replicated anywhere else. Or Google, you get crazy technology and usually craziness in general, but crazy technology. If you're really looking for super technical stuff, you have to Google people are the best. So, DEC people were good. IBM had a culture, and I think still does, frankly. I don't think it's ever left. Because when it got transformed into more of a services company, it never regained the technical acumen, and in fact, that has been atrophying consistently. And I don't know if there's anything left there. I mean, the question is, what's left there? And this comes back to one of my fundamentals about these things, which is companies are not immortal. They grow. Successful. Most companies are not successful, but even successful companies, they reach a pinnacle point and they stay there for some period of time, maybe days, maybe months, maybe years, maybe decades, but rarely more than decades. And then they decline and eventually they disappear. And I would not be surprised if IBM disappears in 20 years. I mean, it may not, but I would not be surprised. And just like HP is in the process of disappearing, right? Hasn't disappeared, but it's broken in two.
So you moved into PM. Is the opportunity to be more involved in those strategic conversations, was that a key?
I think so, because that's where I think I excel. My sort of strength lies in understanding product well enough to know what to do, and then providing and then communicating that in a reasonably articulate way to people so that they're willing to follow. In some ways, that's probably my strongest secret to success is I think my mind is structured to be intuitively capable of understanding technical content to a level of detail that I need to, which is not expertise by any means. It's always miles away from expertise, just to be clear. I'm just deep enough to be dangerous, and then to leverage that to find strategic things, and then to help explain it to people. I think I did, if you look at what I contributed at Snowflake, a lot of that was taking the work that Benoit and Terry did, the fundamental work they did, and translating it into language that people could understand and get excited about, frankly.
There's a tension in management between, Amazon calls it the deep dive, other people call it micromanagement, but there's a tension that you were just talking about that is a really interesting distinction that leaders have to figure out how to make. Do I go all the way down into the gory details and override, something that I just know is wrong in the details, or do I need to know enough of those details to be able to say that the presentation manager's 0 point needs to be in the lower right and not the top left? Or, Or is it sufficient to rely on your team to know the better answer? That's a real tension. How do you draw that line?
It's not sufficient. It's never sufficient to rely on the team. It is, however, important to be judicious about where you apply oversight. And again, I think it comes back to that intuitive understanding of strategy and focusing on strategy and what matters there, and only overriding when it has strategic importance. Right? If it's tactical, you're better off letting them execute. And number one, I find that at least 40% of the time, maybe more, I'm wrong. We'll talk about how often I'm wrong. And by the way, the simplest thing is, and I said this to to a CEO that I'm on the board of recently, is that when I push on something, I've learned after 30 years of this mistake that when I push on something and it doesn't go anywhere, it's always because I'm wrong. And usually, by the way, I'm wrong on timing, I want to point out. I mean, sometimes I'm wrong, just wrong, but probably more times than not, I'm just too early. And the team isn't ready for it.
Is it the team's not ready for it, or are you one of those people who tends to have the technology vision farther in advance than the market? Sometimes
it's the latter. More often than not, the team isn't ready for it, and the market would be ready because I try and put my focus first of all, when I have focused on things that the market wasn't ready for, those are the examples where I am wrong. I mean, those are where I'm just wrong at that. That is an example where I am wrong, because if the market is not ready, then it's not ready. It's not the right time. And Microsoft is filled with examples, many of which I have fingerprints on, of things that were done too early. I mean, the tablet being perhaps one of the most simple, iconic examples where we were the first and we obviously screwed it up. So no, usually it's because the team is just not ready for it, and the market could be ready for it. And if and then usually just if you wait 6 months or a year, you can make it happen.
You spent an inordinate amount of time, you said it before, and it's something that struck me about you even back when we first started to meet each other. You picked up a lot of fires. You ran, it seemed like, so did you run to fires, or were you
No, I got pushed to them. No, I never run to them. No, in my career at Microsoft, I was placed pretty much. Paul, for a long time. Moved me from one spot to another, and then one trouble spot to another, and then I did that a little bit, later in my career also.
That had to feel pretty good that there was enough confidence in you that that you were the guy to go fix that.
Sure, it did feel good. It felt great. I mean, look, I love my career. I still love Microsoft. I think Microsoft's a great company, and Satya's doing a fantastic job there. And I think, although I do admit, when I look back at Microsoft, and I'm very sure of this now, I'm super sure that the Microsoft I remember never happened. It's very rose-colored. The most of the memories are rose-colored. And then I step back and go, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh, ooh, that wasn't so pleasant, was it? Ooh, that hurt. There were a lot of very negative experiences at Microsoft, but there was also a lot of great. I mean, it's a great company, and it went through a lot. We went through a lot together.
The thing that is surprising to me is that you were a guy who saw the good in people. You were the guy who was warm and supportive of people. You were a guy who really led by building a team of a group of people to get along in an environment that was, hallmarked by lots of prickly people who were, and it was interesting.
Very conflict-oriented.
Yeah, and it was an interesting thing that somebody said to me. I was talking to somebody at Amazon, and they said, the problem we have with the Microsoft people is that they all have sharp elbows, which I thought was a really interesting way to put that. True. So did you feel like you were pushing against something, or did you feel like you were in the right all the time being that kind of a leader?
Well, first of all, remember, I was a product of the Microsoft culture, right? I mean, let's just start with that. right? I mean, I didn't come out of school to Microsoft. I'd had 7 or 8 years of background in industry outside of college, and then I did work when I was in industry when I was in college, but I was definitely a product of the Microsoft culture. I mean, I was weaned at Microsoft. I often say that. I rose a little differently. I think the thing that allowed me to do what I did is I have security in my technical intuition. I believe in my intuition. Now, I'm not always right, and I'm often wrong by timing too. I mean, often you're right, but you're wrong by timing. But I believe in the intuition, and that was something that allowed me to create a basis for me to operate on everything, right? Because the thing about technical companies, and it's really important, you can talk about culture and everything else, but nothing matters like the product. Let me just be as clear as I can be. It's always about the experience and product of the customer. I mean, the world is all services, so you're delivering something all the time. So the service you're delivering is everything. But then it turns out that's the what. This is where I keep coming back to the what, and then there's the how. There's the what, and there's the how. And I believe the how really matters. It really matters. And I especially believe it matters for technology companies because we have a very different set of obligations to the world than companies that build bricks. Now, companies that build bricks perform a crucial service to the world. We need bricks. But technology is affecting the way people live and operate in very fundamental ways. And the morals associated with it are deeply intertwined. The culture of a company is now embedded in their products and present, and I can see it. As a guy that looks at and knows these companies and knows the cultures, I know the Microsoft culture, and I go, dang, look what they just did. That was stupid as hell, and they did it for cultural reasons. And I know why they did it, because I know that company. And I can see similar things. I don't know Google or Amazon as well, but I see similar things in those companies. When they make mistakes, it's often culturally rooted. And so to me, in particular, this what and this how are particularly tightly integrated in technology companies because the how in some ways regulates the what. So these two are deeply intertwined, and I believe very strongly in the how. And I sought to demonstrate that in what we created at Snowflake. I think quite successfully, although it had a rather dramatic turn of events that changed the culture pretty substantially. But we definitely built a culture at Snowflake that was a very focused on how in addition to the what, and it was very oriented towards the values that we defined. I feel very strongly about the importance of building value-based companies. And I distinguish now this what and the how in a way, the way you can actually turn this and discuss this in much more business terms is to talk about how you balance values-based cultures with performance-based culture. Because historically, the world has been managed through performance-based cultures. I mean, I think the Romans figured this out with whips. They were very effective back a couple thousand years ago. It worked. It does work. Whips work. They work. And threatening and having a culture that is defined by you achieve performance or you're out, which is historically what a lot of companies are, and many companies still are. I don't think that's the right thing for tech, but I also believe that performance-based attributes are critical inside every culture, including values-based culture.
So you had an opportunity to go and essentially, not start from the very beginning, but you were early at Snowflake to establish its culture and its values-based culture.
When I joined Snowflake, we were pre-revenue, zero. Revenue is easy to declare. It was zero. The company had been in existence for just under 2 years. Benoit and Terry had built the database, the SQL database was functional, although many features were missing. The but the infrastructure around it was all scaffolding and had to be redone. So there was a lot of work that went into that. And, to some extent, you talk about my fixing things at Microsoft. I got tired of it, I have to admit. And I realized how I was tired of picking up other people's broken stuff. And, when we went and when I joined Snowflake, it was a great group of people with the fundamentals of values that were just deeply correct, deeply correct. There was nothing really broken at Snowflake. Nothing was broken. Very little was done. I mean, it was very early, but nothing was broken. I mean, except the scaffolding layer that had to be rewritten, which the engineering team was effectively doing. And, I came in there and, so it was a sort of a ragtag group of great people. We tried to do a mission statement, which was a complete failure because I worked with my founders on it and we were not ready for it. We're just not ready. And it turned out to be kind of a mamby-pamby, little bit of everything, horrible mission statement. So we sort of shelved that and I put that aside. And then, what happened, there was a natural uprising of a desire to express the values of the company and write them down. And that was driven predominantly out of several people in engineering, but it was very infectious across the company. And so, I just encouraged that. And, from that came the first 7 values of Snowflake. And generally speaking, they've been almost unchanged. We enhanced it a little bit. A year later, when we did that, the first 7 values, which I'm very proud of those values. And then we realized we were missing something on inclusion. We had it in there, but it wasn't enough. So we added an 8th value. And I really love some of them, like the 7th value is make each other the best. I love that value. Because what else do you really want in a team? And then the last value we added, which I just love these words, I can't imagine better words, is celebrate our differences. And it talks about differences and what that means in terms of diversity. And it was fascinating because about a year later, it was almost the same time frame, might have been, I'm trying to remember, it was 2016 or 2017, I think it was 2017, when the whole James Damore thing exploded at Google. And, there was all these issues about conservatives inside Silicon Valley companies and whether their voices were actually heard and stuff. And it was it's really problematic for Google. And so I spent a ton of time looking into that and discovered something fascinating that almost nobody knew, but has always been true, which is Google has no values. Google has no value. They have 10 things we know to be true.
And they have don't be evil, I mean.
Well, that's in the 10 things we know to be true.
Yeah.
Okay. And 10 things we know to be true is brilliant, but it's not values. Okay. And they also have a code of conduct, which is required, but certainly is not values. That's a thou shalt nots. Values are different because values are aspirational or maybe not aspirational, but they are something we always seek to live up to. And, the thing that's important about values is we violate our values all the time. I don't like it when I do it, but people do it all the time. And sometimes, values are judgment calls, really. So sometimes that's okay that they're not thou shalt nots. They're different than that. There are things to attempt to do in the way you live your life. And things that you're trying to achieve as you interact with everyone, including your customers and your fellow coworkers. But we sometimes fall back on that, and we don't live up to it. But it's not a crime to say I made a mistake and didn't follow our values. I did that a number of times. I would get in front of the whole company and say, I don't think I followed our values here in this case, and here's what happened. And and having that example that says that, hey, when you make a mistake, you will make mistakes on this. You will. But you want to work to not. Your objective is to uphold these. And honestly, I will take those 8 values of Snowflake. I mean, you can, as I work with every company I work with, I talk to them about the values they set, and they should set their own values. Snowflake isn't God-given and correct, but they're darn good. They're darn good. The other thing about values is really important. I had this conversation with Satya, is that they need to be clear. They're not one word, okay? You can't explain a value in one word or two words. You need a sentence or two. It really matters to put a sentence or two underneath it to give people guidance. The purpose of values is guidance, to provide guidance to people. They have to understand what it means to be guided. So if you look at the words underneath the values of Snowflake, sometimes they're surprising. Sometimes they're not what you would expect. In integrity, we talk about conflict and resolving conflict in integrity, because that's what it's really all about. That's really where integrity matters, is in conflict, right? And so the words, you can say, integrity everywhere, great. Integrity everywhere, great. But what the heck does that mean? And I think that's very important in these things. And I think it was an important part. Again, one of the things I think I am helpful at is I think I am good at understanding what needs to be done in strategy and then articulating it to people in a way they can hear it. And, in doing that, you have to be clear, simple, and you have to be repetitive. You have to do it again and again and again. Every time you talk as a leader, you talk. I didn't get up once, not once. In 5 years at Snowflake, did I get up in a team meeting and not mention our values? I don't think there was a single time.
When Snowflake then went to go IPO, they felt like they needed they turned a little to a different form of leadership, a performance-based leadership as opposed to a values-based leadership.
Yeah.
And if I could put words in your mouth, you sort of understood that change, but felt it was not a change, not the right thing to do.
Well, yeah, it was not communicated to me well. I mean, it was one of the things that, in this case, the board at Snowflake did not follow our values when they made that transition. Let me say it that way. It was not a values-led transition, and it was not done in a way that was values-based. There was a great irony of this, which was, I was totally taken by shock. I was shocked. I had no idea. I mean, I should have known if in retrospect, because there were enough challenges I was having with at least one board member, but I should have known, but I didn't. Fact is, I didn't. And the reason I didn't was very simple, because, and I remember I had a conversation with my head of sales literally the day of, when he was worried that something was coming. I said, that's not going to happen. And he said, well, how do you know that? I said, because they would have talked to me. I mean, I think this can't be happening because no one said anything to me. And so I was totally taken aback when it did happen. And that made it an impossible situation, because I was literally in an impossible situation. The day before, I had just given a talk, which was, in my opinion, perhaps the finest speech I've ever given in my life. I gave the day before. It was certainly the one I will remember the most. And it was a team meeting, and it was literally all about the how and the what. The entire meeting, I spent 45 minutes talking about the what and the how, and how at Snowflake, it's not just the what we do, but it's the how we do it, and we do the how in a values-based way. And I brought that back, and the reason this was important was because we were about to do our first conference in June of 2019, and this was just 2 months before then. I was preparing for my biggest talk at Snowflake, which was our conference talk. And I'd worked with my marketing department, and I put a whole set of slides together that literally the next day I was going to LA to present to some customers as a dry run for this conference that was coming up in another month and a half. And the talk was really about the transitions in the world and how technology has affected the world, and how we've gone through, how we went from, literally going back to the 1700s when we had the Industrial Revolution, and how the combination of water-based power and then ultimately coal and steam, built locomotives, and then the electric light bulb, and then all these things, and that we're now in a period of information. We've now transitioned into the information age. And, Snowflake is a leader in the information. And the whole talk was about, in this new world we're moving into, which is all about information and data, Snowflake is a leader in this. And therefore, how we operate with data, because data is so important and it's so intertwined with privacy and people's personal information. How we operate is just as important as the what. And this is how we as a company are going to be different, because we're so much more, our how is so much stronger. And I was fired the next day. And they brought in a performance guy who changed the culture, tried at least to change the culture completely. The company culture has changed considerably. And it's much more, there was a recent article in Forbes where this was super clear. It's like, you get one chance, and if you don't get the chance, you get thrown off the boat. If you fail, you get thrown off the boat. You don't get a second chance. And so, and that's a style. That is a style of management. Like, say, it goes back at least to the Romans, and it is known to be effective. I think it's very regressive. I think it's very yesterday. Personally, I think performance is important, and performance attributes are critical in every culture. They were clearly present in Snowflake. We never missed a number, by the way. I mean, in the entire time I ran the company, we never missed a quarter, and we were literally doubling or tripling every year. So, we were literally the fastest growing, private company on the planet. We never missed a quarter. And now, so far they haven't missed a quarter. Yeah, I hope they don't miss this quarter. I think in this performance thing, I do think there's a fascinating lessons to learn, because Snowflake has kicked butt. Okay, since right. I mean, it's doing great. I learned a little bit. I think I learned some things about performance and the importance of interacting with performance. Dovetailing performance into values. But I don't think they were absent. I mean, you could dial it up a little bit more than we did, but I'm not sure. I mean, again, the results were positive, so I'm not sure any result. I'm not sure what thing I would change except my interactions with the board. I mean, that was the most difficult. Put aside when my dad died, it was that level of an experience. That's what I compare it to, is the loss of my parent, and because I lost my family basically. Because Snowflake was my other family. I mean, I have my family, which is wonderful, but it was my other family.
Bob Muglia has spent a career being a thoughtful and passionate leader with the technical skills and values focus to help teams excel. I want to thank him for his time and for sharing his experience with us. Leading Smart is from me, Chris Williams. You can find out more about the show and discover other resources for leaders at my website, clwill.com. I'm sure you know someone else who'd like the show. Please share it with them or spread the word on social media. I'd also love your feedback. I'm the CL Will on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Or send an email to pod@clwill.com. That's it for this episode. The next episode wraps up the series on organizational culture. We'll look at how you as a leader can make change happen. I hope you'll listen. Until then, please remember that each of the several dozen decisions you make today are part of Leading Smart.